What's up, YouTube? My name is Jowell. Um, First, I just want to say thank you to the boys from Trans People of Color, Trans POC at YouTube. Special shout out to Phoenix. I'm really happy to be part of your video this week. And so, without further ado, well, actually, let me just give a quick introduction of myself. My name is Jowell. I am a 20-year-old student at Binghamton University. I study sociology and Latin American Caribbean studies. Um, and I identify as male. I am female to male, transgender. Without further ado, so the topic that I want to talk about is basically what it means to transition and how that is interrelated with one, patriarchy, and two, class privilege. So, first, patriarchy. First, let's just talk about what it means to transition. So, usually in the trans community, as you guys probably know, when we say so and so is transitioning, well, usually that can mean it can be they're gonna go by certain pronouns, it's gonna go by certain a different name. A lot of times it includes binding and hormones, um, haircuts, like just this physical transition. Like transitioning a lot of times is physical. It is physical. Because the gender has always been there. You know what I mean? Like you don't just become this gender. Like you are this gender. So that's what's really interesting to me when people like just the word transitioning itself and how it's used. But related to that, it's a big, I mean, maybe it's kind of overlooked, but it's a problem. It's straight up a problem when the idea of transitioning is directly related to this classic image of being a man. It's problematic when the idea of transitioning is basically hypermasculinizing yourself. It's a problem when trans men who don't want to go on hormones or who don't want to bind or are more feminine, they're more flamboyant. They're not this like manly man, and that's a big problem because there's a huge problem, especially in the trans community, with men who are more feminine, who are not just this like typical image, this macho man. They get shit on for it. You know what I mean? They're first a lot of times like genderqueer brothers who are who are just genderqueer trans men, they get shit on. They're like, well, why do you want to be on hormones? Like you don't identify as a man. Like I should be on hormones. I'm a trans man. You know, like that's horrible. It really makes me upset because I see this constantly. I see this constantly in the trans community, and it drives me crazy about trans men who their transition is one invalidated because they don't want to go through this process. They don't want to go through this masculinizing process. And two, it bothers me that trans men even do this. It's like, dude, this is your community. This is not what you should be doing. And this goes back to patriarchy. This goes back to male dominated spaces where anything that is not essentially depicting like this heterosexual, basically anything feminine hating man, like I hate it. It makes me so mad, and this bothers me a lot because, I mean, we all have different transitions. Our idea of transitioning is different from each other. We can't think that masculinity is this one thing. We think that masculinity has this one definition, and anything that does not fit that is more feminine. Like, I feel like a lot of times, like, you know, masculinity and femininity are relational to each other. So there's really like it's all arbitrary. We don't have a clear-cut definition of what it is. We know more what it's not than what it is. And two, if you identify as a man, anything that you do is an expression of your masculinity. That is your masculinity. Whatever you do as a man, whether it be if you're on hormones, if you're not, if you wear women's clothing, if you wear men's clothing, if you have long hair, if you. I think most of all, we really need to just learn how to respect the masculinity of men, of genderqueer men, of trans men who don't want to do certain processes and who just don't be an asshole. You know what I mean? Like, it's that simple, you know? If someone identifies as this, if they want to be called this, if they don't want to do this, if they don't want to do this, respect that, you know? Like, that's what it comes down to. Alright, so part two. So, like I said before, this goes back to patriarchy, essentially, but also class privilege. And also, men of color, this is particularly significant because what I study a lot in school is how race and class intersect with each other, and how basically all spaces, especially basically any spaces that are consequences of capitalism or are directly related to capitalism. So basically financial spaces. Um, they're always racially organized. Um, Everything related to the entire country, at least in the United States, and maybe I guess the world, is racially organized but economically executed. And this is a whole other thing, so I'm not going to get into this too much. But because things are economically executed but racially organized, we have a really disproportionate amount of men of color to white men to I'm sorry to a really disproportionate amount to white trans men and trans men of color being able to have access to things like hormones and to things like binders and stuff like that. And again, this goes right back to how we see the idea of being a man and how we feel like we need these things. Like, this is how we have internalized manhood. And we feel like we need these things like binders and hormones, surgery, whatever. But these things cost money. Even if you have like an underworks binder, you need at least like $30, $40 for that. And somebody who doesn't have a lot of money, that's a lot to them. And a lot of times, as we know, we can't get these in stores. We can't do anything like that. So, you know, how are we gonna get a credit card? How, you know what I mean? It's like this. It's a big problem, basically. And this oftentimes affects trans men of color way more than it affects um, white trans men, just because that's kind of the nature of money, I guess you could say. Um, a lot of men of color, just people of color in general, don't have these types of economic privileges, and so our transitions are affected. We are affected by it, and it fucking sucks. You know what I mean? Just straight up. It sucks that there is this big divide in the trans community with race, with race and class, whether it's intentional or not, whether this is just how the nature of things. This isn't really, honestly, any different than how things are already organized in the world, but it does show itself really clear in the trans community. And if this is how people have access, this is the ratio that people have access to things like binders and stuff like that, because this is what we feel like we need as trans men. This goes back to how our transitions get invalidated because we aren't on hormones, we aren't binding. Why is it that if I'm telling you that I'm transitioning but I don't want to bind or I don't want hormones, I'm not interested in that? What makes it that my transition is different? So, yeah, this might have been kind of a rant, but I hope that I kind of explained myself pretty well and that you feel me, you know? But yeah, I hope you really saw how they intersect with each other and how, in conclusion, just don't be an asshole and fight the white supremacy.